Okay, so today we're going to take a look at setting up a template for an InDesign template for visual scripting. And we're going to start by hitting Command N for a new document. I already have a template set up for Dargo layout, which is for my comic book. I've already done all the entry for that, but I'm going to create a new one for you. My units are set to centimeters right now because I'm working at a French size, but in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to set up an American comic book. Keep in mind that if you're you're not going to be working in comics, you're not working for print even, you can still use this technique. You just need to set up your page size in the aspect ratio of your destination. So if it's film, if you're working 4:3 or 5 to whatever, you need to know what the ratio is of the final work and set up accordingly. But I'll just set this up as an American comic book. So standard American comic book is 6 5/8 wide by 10 1/4 high. Okay. As soon as I click out of these boxes, it's converting to centimeters because that's how my thing is set up. But you can enter it in whatever unit you want to enter it in, whatever type of units. Okay, so that's the first thing. You set your page size. Number two, you want to set your margins to something reasonable. Now, what you're doing with your margins is you're saying the page size is your trim size. So for print, whether you're working on a children's book, you're working for comics, whatever, that's the trim size of the book. That's the size it's going to be cut to. But you want to have a live area that's smaller than the trim size so that any really important material doesn't get cut off or mangled by faulty printing techniques or whatever. So I would say as a minimum you want to do 1.5 centimeters or half an inch at least. So I'll set this to 1.5 and it's locked, so when I do that it's going to make it the same all the way around. You can unlock it and make it different in order to do a really fancy thing where you have a little bit more space on the bottom, less on the top. I've done that with some layouts. But in any case, not right now. Standard American comic book is 24 or 32 pages, so let's say 32. You can also add pages later, but it's handy to have them all in there now. Then I'm going to set number of columns. Now, I could do this later, but if I do it now, then I will have the advantage of just having done one step already, and also the guides will be a different color from other guides that I'll put in later. So I'm going to set this to 3 columns in order to have the gutters all set up for me. And because it's a slightly smaller book, I'm going to say, let's try a 1/4 inch and see what that looks like. Not a 1/4 centimeter, 1/4 inch. Actually, let me do this in inches too, just to have it all consistent. Let's say 0.625, 5/8 inch. Okay. You can also here, and this is very handy, go into more options. If you're going to be doing bleeds on your book, you can set your bleeds here, and your template will be set up for it ahead of time. So, very handy to do that now, just in case you want to use them. And you basically want to make your bleeds at least 1/4 inch, say 5 millimeters on the outside. It may be even more like a centimeter. Okay, so let's go into the actual document. Hit OK. Now, because I'm working on my Cintiq, it opened up on the other screen, so I'm going to drag it over here. All right, so this is what you get initially. Now, these gutters look too big for me for this page. These, if you were to do 3 panels across here, these gutters would be way too wide. So I'm going to change the gutter size. So first of all, what I'm going to do is, now that I have this thing open, I'm going to go into my preferences and change my units to inches so that everything appears in whole numbers. Inches. So, in order to change the width of the gutters, go into margins and columns, and I have a 1/4 inch gutter. It's too much, so I'm going to put it at, see if how an 1/8 inch looks. Probably too narrow. This is important to set this now because you're going to be using it in all of your guides, and it's going to carry through if you end up printing this out and using it to create your thumbnails or sketches, you're going to need to have the gutters set basically the way you want them to be set. It'll also help you visualize what you're doing on the page. So let me set this to, that looks pretty good. Okay, so just the pieces of the page that you have here already, these are the things that get set up. This red line on the outside is the bleed. This black line is the trim. This purple line and pink line is the live area that you want to keep all of your important material inside of. And then these are the gutters here. Again, if you're working in some other field, you're not working in comics, you can use this just as easily. You simply change the kinds of divisions and guides and so on that you're setting up based on what you're doing. If you're doing film, it's the easiest thing in the world because all you want is a blank rectangle with no guides at all, because everything's going to happen in the same image. Next, I'm going to go in and create more lines for a grid. So I'm going to go in under Layout and use Create Guides. And here you can create as many guides as you need to. You want to create at least, if you're doing comics, you want to do at least a few more sets. And so you could do them sort of one at a time here. So for rows, these are horizontal. This is creating your tiers. You can do a 3-tier setup. And what did I say here? 0.15 inches gutter. And for columns, you can also do, say, a 2-column setup. Make sure you're fitting guides to margins and not page. Now what that's going to do is it's going to divide the area equally within your live area. If you go to page, it's going to divide your whole page up, which means that it's not going to, dividing in half will work fine, but if you're dividing in thirds, you'll end up with a really large center tier and the top and bottom tiers will be too small. So make sure that it's set that way. Do preview, take a look what it's going to look like. Oh, that looks great. Okay. Now I can actually change the colors of the guides in order to have them be visibly different. I like using yellow because it's pale, and that's under Layout Ruler Guides. And now I'll create another set of guides to do quarters. So I could do a 4-tier layout if I want to. 3, and again remembering to make the gutter 1.5 inches or 0.15 inches. I'm sorry, 4. Okay. Now this can really look messy. It can be hard to see what you're supposed to see. The different colors helps, but it can be confusing. So if you need to hide all of these things so you can just see what's on the page, what you've actually drawn so far or written, you can use Command and semicolon to make all of them disappear. You can also use the letter W, which actually trims out the exterior here so that all the bleeds are cut off. So essentially this is like your print. It's a preview of your print document. Whereas Command semicolon, you'll still see your artboard, and so if anything's out here you can still see it and manipulate it. So that's the difference between those two. So now we have a grid structure, and what we need to do next is to create layers. So here's your layers palette. It exists under the window menu, and you can pop it up. Usually it starts out in a sort of box up here, but I like to break it out. I like to break out all of my commonly used menus and have them open all the time, because that saves me a lot of time in opening and shutting these things, and also means that as long as I set up my artboard in such a way that it's not overlapping these menus, I end up not having a problem with the menus overlapping the artboard. So like if you open up this, for example, it's going to pop up over here, and that's annoying. So if you're not going to use it regularly, then I leave it up here, but if you use it all the time, you leave it here. So notice what I use all the time is the object styles, the layers, pages, and links. And links I don't use now, but I will use once I actually place material inside this script. If I need to update the material or whatever, I use the links menu, but I use it less often than that, especially not when drafting. Okay, so go into the layers menu, and we already have one layer, so we can make that layer into dialogue, say. Okay. New layer. Make this layer into description, new layer, make this one, and setting this up for comics, but you'll have to do what makes sense for you in terms of the form that you're working in. For example, you won't have panel borders if you're working in film or children's books. I think the better word for this is sequence titles. Thumbnails you don't use until you're doing sketching and so on. You could create another layer for visual notes. So if you're doing sketches or drawing that go in for placement or just to remind you what needs to go in a certain place, you could create another layer for that. Alright, so these are in this layer in this order now, but in order to make them the most useful for me, I reorder them so that dialogue is on the top, and then description, thumbnails is on the bottom, then panel borders. So, dialogue, description, panel borders, sequence, titles, thumbnails. Again, dialogue, clear, obvious. Description, this is useful for everybody in every form. Panel borders you may or may not need to use. Sequence titles, I'll explain why you use that or how I use that in a few minutes. And then thumbnails, this is for when you start dropping your artwork in. You can call it thumbnails, you can call it art, you can call it whatever makes sense. So now I've got my layers, but there's nothing in them. The next job is to create object styles. So the way you create an object style is first you have to create paragraph styles. The easiest way to create a paragraph style is to first use your text tool and make a style that you like. So if we're going to do something for dialogue, here's a dialogue sample. Select that, change it to my own font. This is a font of my hand lettering that I've had made in the past. But you might use some other lettering font that looks kind of like your own hand lettering, or if you're not using lettering, whatever. I mean, this is what works for you. For me, I'm trying to create a dialogue that is essentially the shape and size that I will want it to be when I eventually hand letter. And I, in fact, print these dialogue balloons out, these word balloons, and trace them. Usually I'd go to maybe 10 point or something like that. That looks pretty readable. Remember, this is a printed page. This is the size of the printed page, not what you would do on original artwork where you'd actually blow this up. So like when I print these out and trace them, I will blow them up to 150% and then trace them. So 10 point, you could even go 9 point. You don't want to go too little though. So anyway, whatever size makes sense. I want to have it centered in the box. That looks like what I want for my dialogue paragraph style. So I'll create a paragraph style, new paragraph style. So if you see paragraph style 2 pops up, paragraph style 1 plus able plus 1 plus size 9 point plus align centered. So I'm going to call this dialogue. Okay. You can repeat this process with other samples. So, for example, when I'm writing description, I like to have it visually distinct from dialogue so that I can easily pick it out and see what's supposed to be description, what's not. So, I will, minion, whatever, it doesn't really matter what font you use, but I'll make it italic, usually not that much bigger than dialogue, so it doesn't use up too much space, but I will also make it a color. So I usually make it red, that's my habit, just so that it stands out and is different from dialogue. So now I'm going to go into paragraph styles and create a new style based on this. This is description. Okay. And now I'm going to do that for each type of lettering that I need to use. Now we're ready to create object styles for these objects, or to start creating them. So we can close this paragraph styles thing. For dialogue, use your object selector here. For dialog, you're going to want to have a actual panel border on here. Here, here. Okay, so we want a black stroke and a white fill so that when you put it over artwork, it still shows up. And the stroke, you can figure out how big you want it to be, but it doesn't really matter all that much because, again, this is not, at the moment, this isn't final lettering. This isn't something that's going to go into print. You can always tweak it later. We also want for me, you can make the box any shape you want to. So you can do, in object, you can go and you can convert the shape to an ellipse if you want to have a traditional looking word balloon. For me, this loses too much space. I don't like using an ellipse, so I will use a rounded rectangle. And you can also change the size of these corners. So this is my typical dialogue balloon shape, what I'm using, and I don't bother with tails or anything. It's just you get a basic sense of the shape and size of where the dialogue is going to balloon is going to be, and you can write to size, and so you're making sure your dialogue's not taking too much space and so on. So then I will go into object styles. I'm going to create a new object style, and I'm going to call it dialogue balloon based on basic text frame. Make sure, see this? Make sure this is clicked on so that it includes the paragraph style with the object style. If it's off, then you're going to have to keep reapplying that paragraph style to when you're writing. With this, every time you click dialogue balloon, the lettering is going to turn into dialogue lettering, and the balloon will turn into this rounded corner thing. So make sure that's clicked on and say OK. Now this one doesn't have anything in particular you need to do with it, so I'm just going to create a new one here. Description. All of these basically have no particular qualities that need to be included with the object style, but the object style does need to include the paragraph style. That's the important thing. You could, of course, just use the paragraph style for this since you're not doing anything particular with the object, but that would mean having two menus open. So if you only want to have one menu open, you just create these all as object styles. Okay. I need one more style, which I haven't created yet. For that, I'm going to select a rectangle here, make a rectangle, make a, say, 2-point border on it. It's transparent, doesn't block anything out. That's what I want. I'm going to create a new object style, which is panel border. And for this, you can leave paragraph styles off because there's no paragraph style associated with it. Okay, so now I have all of my pieces in place. Good idea to save at this point. In fact, I should have saved earlier, but the one thing that we are going to want to do with this eventually is to make it into a template. Alright, so now that I've created all of these things, I'm actually going to delete all of this stuff. And then I'm going to save it as a template. Okay, so that way you don't have those windows, those dialogue balloons popping up when you make a new document. So one thing I just realized, scroll to the next page, that I failed to do is I didn't change the gutters and I didn't add the guides on the master page. I just added them on page 1. So here's a good lesson. Don't do that. Down here is where you have your master pages. The thing you want to do before you do any of those changes that I did before is click into your master pages. So I'm going to go in and do that all again. Now it's applied to all my other pages as well. Okay, so now that I have this template, I can close this document, reopen it. When I reopen it, you can see here, an untitled document, and it's ready to go. And I will demonstrate using this template in a separate video.